Long before the ark. Long before the rain. Long before Noah heard the warning that would change his life, Genesis describes a world moving steadily toward darkness. Violence is spreading. Human corruption is deepening. And somewhere in that ancient world, beneath skies we can only imagine, lives a man named Enoch. The Bible tells us very little about him. His story occupies only a handful of lines. Yet those lines have fascinated readers for centuries. Genesis says Enoch lived 65 years and became the father of Methuselah. After that, he lived another 300 years. Then comes the phrase that separates him from almost everyone around him. Enoch walked with God. And then he was no more. Because God took him. No grave is mentioned. No final illness. No ordinary statement that he died. Just a man walking with God. And then gone. Who was Enoch? What happened to him? And how did this quiet figure from Genesis eventually become associated with heavenly journeys, rebellious angels, terrifying giants, divine judgment, and one of the strangest ancient religious books connected to the biblical world? That book is known today as 1 Enoch. Most Christians have never read it. Some have never heard of it. Others have encountered extraordinary claims about it on the internet, that it was hidden, banned, removed, or suppressed because someone was afraid of what it contained. The real story is not quite that simple. In fact, it is considerably more interesting. To understand the Book of Enoch, we first have to return to the man whose name stands over it. And to one small interruption in one of the Bible's longest genealogies. The man who disappeared. Genesis chapter 5 can feel repetitive when you first read it. A man lives. He has a son. He lives many more years. He has other sons and daughters. Then comes the same ending. And he died. Adam dies. Seth dies. Enosh dies. Kenan dies. Mahalalel dies. Jared dies. Generation after generation, the rhythm continues. Life. Children. Years. Death. And then the rhythm breaks. Enoch appears. He lives 365 years, a long life to us, though unusually short compared with the ages given to the men surrounding him. But Genesis does not emphasize the number. It emphasizes his relationship with God. Twice in just a few verses we are told that Enoch walked with God. Then the expected words never come. Genesis does not say, and he died. It says, he was not, for God took him. Centuries later, Hebrews 11 returns to this mysterious statement and says Enoch was taken so that he did not experience death. Again, the explanation is brief. The New Testament does not describe a journey through the heavens. It does not tell us what Enoch saw. It does not give us conversations between Enoch and angels. It simply remembers him as a man of faith who pleased God. And perhaps that very silence helped create the mystery. Because ancient readers noticed what we notice. Where did he go? Why him? What might a man who walked with God have been allowed to see? Over time, Jewish writings associated with Enoch began to answer those questions in ways Genesis never does. The result was not a small footnote. It was an enormous expansion of Enoch's world. A world of watchers. Giants. Forbidden knowledge. Places of judgment. Cosmic secrets. And journeys beyond the ordinary boundaries of human sight. What we now call 1 Enoch is an ancient collection of Jewish apocalyptic writings associated with Enoch's name. It appears to have developed in sections over time rather than emerging as one book written at a single moment. Ancient authors sometimes place teachings or visions under the name of a revered figure from the distant past. That does not mean scholars generally believe the Genesis Enoch personally wrote the complete surviving work in the form we have today. But before we worry about manuscripts and history, we need to enter the story itself. Because the oldest and best-known part of 1 Enoch turns toward 4 of the strangest verses in Genesis. Genesis chapter 6. The sons of God. The passage appears almost without warning. Humanity is multiplying. Daughters are being born. Then Genesis says that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took women for themselves. A few lines later, another name appears. The Nephilim. Then the passage moves on. 4 verses. That is all. Genesis gives us just enough information to raise questions and not enough to answer all of them. Who were the sons of God? Christians and Jewish interpreters have offered more than one answer. One ancient interpretation understood them as heavenly beings, rebellious members of the supernatural realm. Another approach has understood them as powerful human rulers or warrior kings who took women according to their desires. Still another Christian interpretation identifies them with the godly line of Seth intermarrying with the ungodly line associated with Cain. Genesis itself does not stop to settle the debate. But 1 Enoch does. Or, more accurately, it chooses one interpretation and develops it into a vast story. According to 1 Enoch, these beings are heavenly watchers. Their task is connected with observing the world. But instead of remaining within their appointed place, a group of them looks upon human women and desires them. The watchers make an agreement. They will descend together. They will cross a boundary between the heavenly and human realms. And they will accept the consequences together. In Enoch's telling, their descent becomes an act of rebellion. Not merely because they come to earth, but because they abandon the order assigned to them. The ancient text places the event around Mount Hermon and describes a large company of watchers participating. That expanded detail belongs to 1 Enoch, not to the brief account in Genesis. Fragments from Qumran preserve this watcher tradition in Aramaic, providing physical evidence that the story circulated in Jewish antiquity. And their violation does not end with relationships between heavenly beings and human women. According to Enoch, they bring something else with them. Knowledge. Knowledge without wisdom. At first, knowledge sounds like a gift. Human beings survive because they learn. They learn how to farm, how to build, how to heal, how to pass wisdom from one generation to another. But the Book of Enoch is interested in another kind of knowledge. Knowledge given outside its proper boundary. Knowledge joined to power without obedience. According to different portions of 1 Enoch, the rebellious watchers teach human beings practices associated with weapons and warfare, sorcery, enchantments, ornamentation, signs of the heavens, and secrets the text believes humanity was not meant to receive in this way. The point is not that every form of craft or learning is evil. The story is about corrupted instruction. Power passing from beings who have already rebelled into the hands of a humanity that is becoming increasingly violent. There is an old question hiding inside that story. What happens when knowledge grows faster than wisdom? Anyone who has lived long enough has probably seen some version of that problem. Human beings become capable of doing something before they have seriously asked whether they should. The tools change. The question does not. But 1 Enoch does not linger in philosophy. The consequences become physical. The offspring associated with the watchers and human women become giants. And the world begins to break under their violence. The Nephilim. Popular culture has turned the Nephilim into almost everything imaginable. Ancient superhumans. Demons. Aliens. Secret bloodlines. Builders of lost civilizations. Most of those claims go far beyond what Genesis actually says. The biblical text is restrained. Genesis 6 mentions the Nephilim, calls them mighty men of ancient renown, and then moves toward the moral condition of humanity. The Lord sees that human wickedness has become great. Genesis says the thoughts of the human heart are continually bent toward evil. A few verses later, the earth is described as corrupt and filled with violence. That is the biblical emphasis. Violence, corruption, judgment. 1 Enoch takes those themes and expands the supernatural element dramatically. In its story, the offspring of the Watchers become destructive giants. They consume what human beings produce. Their appetite becomes impossible to satisfy. Violence escalates. Blood is shed. The created order itself seems to cry out under what has happened. The imagery is extreme, but the direction of the story is familiar to anyone who has read Genesis. The world before the flood has become a world in which boundaries have collapsed. Human violence has filled the earth. And judgment is approaching. Genesis gives us Noah. But 1 Enoch brings another man forward. Enoch. And now the story takes an unexpected turn. The heavenly beings who crossed the boundary need the help of a human being. The Watchers ask for mercy. According to 1 Enoch, judgment is announced against the rebellious Watchers. Their actions cannot simply continue. The corruption they have released will have consequences. And the Watchers are afraid. These are beings who, in the story, once came down from the heavenly realm possessing knowledge human beings did not have. Yet now they turn to Enoch, a man. They ask him to write a petition for them. They want him to intercede. They want forgiveness. There is something almost tragic in the reversal. The Watchers descended as beings with power. Circulation proves circulation. Neither, by itself, settles canon. Yet the New Testament gives us another reason Enoch cannot simply be dismissed as irrelevant background. A short letter near the end of the New Testament seems to know it very well. Jude and the seventh from Adam. The letter of Jude is only 1 chapter long. But it contains one of the most important connections in this entire story. Jude warns about ungodliness and coming judgment. Then, in verses 14 and 15, he refers to Enoch, the seventh from Adam. Jude then gives a prophecy describing the Lord coming with countless holy ones to execute judgment. The wording corresponds closely to 1 Enoch 1:9. This relationship is widely recognized in scholarship. Jude appears to be drawing from, or directly quoting, the Enochic tradition. Now we reach a question that has confused many sincere readers. If Jude quotes Enoch, does that mean the entire Book of Enoch must be scripture? Not necessarily. Biblical writers can refer to material familiar to their audience without turning the entire source of that material into part of the biblical canon. Paul, for example, can use language from non-biblical poets. A reference does not automatically canonize every sentence written by the person or tradition being referenced. But neither should we shrug off Jude's use of Enoch as meaningless. It tells us that this tradition was part of the intellectual and religious world in which at least some early Jewish and Christian readers lived. Jude expects the image to communicate something. And suddenly our historical mystery becomes sharper. Ancient Jews copied Enoch. Jude knew Enochic language. Some early Christians valued the work. So why, when most Christians open their Bibles today, is Enoch not there? Was it removed? The history is more complicated. Was Enoch removed from the Bible? This is where internet videos often turn a complicated history into a single dramatic sentence. The Book of Enoch was removed from the Bible. It also creates the wrong picture. It suggests that there was once a single universally agreed Christian Bible containing 1 Enoch, and that at some later moment a church official, council, pope, or institution secretly reached in and pulled it out. That is not a responsible description of how the biblical canon developed. Ancient Jewish communities did not all define their collections of sacred literature in exactly the same way at the same time. Early Christian communities inherited Jewish scriptures and, over time, recognized collections of apostolic writings that became the New Testament. This process occurred across different languages, regions, churches, and centuries. 1 Enoch was known and valued in some circles. But it did not become part of the Old Testament canon received by most Jewish communities or by most later Christian traditions. Historical scholarship on Old Testament canon likewise treats the story as a long process rather than a single removal event. There is, however, a remarkable exception. Christianity in Ethiopia preserved Enoch. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo tradition includes the Book of Enoch within its broader biblical canon, and the work survived in complete form especially through manuscripts in Guizi, the classical language of Ethiopian Christianity. Sources on the Ethiopian biblical tradition note Enoch among the books preserved there. That preservation is one reason we can read the complete work today. Fragments survive in Aramaic and other ancient witnesses. But the Ethiopic manuscript tradition preserved the whole book through centuries in which it was largely absent from Western Christian Bibles. That story is mysterious enough without adding a secret Vatican chamber. No hidden council is needed. No frightened pope. No conspiracy. Just the complicated history of ancient texts moving through different communities. Some preserved. Some copied less often. Some received as canonical in one tradition but not another. And that leaves Christians today with a practical question. Should you read it? Should Christians read 1 Enoch? Perhaps the best answer begins by separating curiosity from authority. If your Christian tradition does not regard 1 Enoch as scripture, reading it does not require pretending that it is another lost gospel or a missing chapter of Genesis. You can read an ancient religious text because it helps you understand the world in which biblical interpretation developed. 1 Enoch can help modern readers see how some ancient Jews interpreted Genesis 6. It gives background to traditions about rebellious angels. It helps explain imagery that appears around Jewish apocalyptic thought. And it makes Jude's language feel less isolated. It can also remind us that the religious world surrounding the Bible was larger than the books eventually gathered inside most modern biblical canons. But the distinctions need to remain clear. Genesis says what Genesis says. 1 Enoch says considerably more. Jude uses Enochic tradition. That does not mean every detail in 1 Enoch becomes a teaching of Jude. For Christians whose churches do not receive Enoch as canonical scripture, it should not quietly be given the same authority as Genesis, Isaiah, the Gospels, Paul's letters, or Revelation. At the same time, dismissing it as worthless simply because it is outside most Bibles would ignore its genuine historical importance. There is a reasonable middle ground. Read carefully. Read curiously. Notice where the text expands scripture. Notice where it reflects the concerns of ancient Jewish readers. And when someone tells you that Enoch proves aliens visited Mount Hermon, that giants built the pyramids, or that the Vatican removed the book to hide supernatural technology, ask a very simple question. Where does the text actually say that? Curiosity is valuable. So is restraint. Especially with ancient mysteries. Back to the man who walked with God. After all of this, it is worth returning to Genesis. Leave the Qumran caves for a moment. Leave the Watchers. The giants. The heavenly journeys. The manuscripts. The arguments about canon. Return to those few quiet verses. Enoch lived. Enoch walked with God. And Enoch was no more. Because God took him. There is a strange contrast here. The literature that eventually gathered around Enoch became enormous. The biblical description of the man remained remarkably small. Perhaps that is part of the reason he still draws our attention. Genesis gives us enough to remember him. But not enough to satisfy every question. What exactly did Enoch experience? We do not know. What did God took him look like? Genesis does not tell us. How much of the later Enochic tradition preserves very early interpretation, and how much reflects developments that came centuries after the world Genesis describes? Those are questions historians continue to examine. But one thing is clear. The Book of Enoch belongs neither in the category of a modern fraud, nor, for most Christian traditions, in the category of a secretly stolen biblical book. It is something more historically interesting. An ancient Jewish collection. A witness to how some people before and around the New Testament era thought about Genesis, angels, judgment, and the unseen world. A book known to ancient readers. A tradition echoed unmistakably in Jude. A work preserved with extraordinary faithfulness in Ethiopian Christianity. And a reminder that the world surrounding the Bible contains writings that can illuminate history without automatically carrying the same authority as Scripture for every Christian tradition. Perhaps some mysteries do not end with a locked door finally opening. Sometimes we discover another hallway. Another question. Another reason to return to the biblical text and look more carefully at words we may have passed over for decades. Enoch's story begins with a man who seems to step beyond the ordinary pattern of human death. And that raises a question far more personal than watchers or ancient manuscripts. Because sooner or later, most of us stand beside a grave. A father's. A mother's. A husband or wife. A brother. A sister. A friend who was part of our lives for 40 or 50 years. And when we walk away from that grave, the mystery is no longer ancient history. It is ours. If there really is life beyond death. If God does not lose the people who belong to Him. If resurrection is more than a beautiful word. Then will we know those people when we see them again? Will a husband recognize the woman he loved for 50 years? Will a mother know her child? Will old friends meet again and still be themselves? Scripture has more to say about that question than many people realize. And that is where our journey goes next. Will we recognize our loved ones in heaven? What Scripture reveals. If stories like this help you look at Scripture with fresh eyes, you're welcome to join us again. And if you have read the Book of Enoch, I would be interested to hear one thing. What do you believe is the most important thing Christians should understand about it?